8 seconds. That's what I wrote in the description, and generally how long it takes for, to secure a meeting with a publisher or to be shrugged off. And that's not a lot of time. And considering how little time it is, you might have a question about, if elevator pitches are so important, why aren't we told more about this, especially when you're going to, school for this or when you're talking to other developers? And it's kind of a tricky question because people don't really ask, what's your elevator pitch? Instead, they generally say things like, tell me about your game or what's your game about. And at this point, you might be thinking, those are very common questions. It doesn't seem very publisher facing, it isn't as complex as a pitch deck. And you're absolutely right, because I mentioned that it's a bit of a trick question because the elevator pitch can be used for publishers, but also it's a good way to talk with your team about the general overview theme or direction you would like to take the game, or with journalists, because it generally fits all those roles. Even when you go to convention and you're talking to people and attendees are asking you about game, an elevator pitch works in all these forms. So before we begin, a little about myself. I'm a co-organizer for Game of Happy Hour, Hong Kong, and been doing this for about 4 years now. I generally have experience in community management, public relations, and marketing. Although it's a little spread out, I usually tend to roll the role within my experiences, so it's hard for me to give numbers. But generally speaking, I have a very deep interest in pitching. I really do enjoy reading pitches from game developers, seeing how they form, how exciting it is, and so on. And today's presentation is purely based off my own experiences and conclusions. So just a quick disclaimer, it's entirely possible that you meet another developer or another lecturer will have a different opinion, and that's perfectly fine. Just understand that this is based on my own experience and my experience only. So a quick overview of what we're going to talk about today. Briefly, we'll go through the 3 traits to an elevator pitch, basically identifiers or a rubric, if you will, to what you can consider and follow when you're forming your own pitches. Next, I'll present 4 elevator pitch formulas or templates. It's basic idea when you don't know where to begin. Here are some ways or methods that other developers commonly use to help start build it. And last, some general don't do's. Over the years, speaking to students and talking to a lot of developers, I'll see pitches that have a lot of common beginner mistakes, and I'll point those out to people today just to show these are things you want to avoid if you can. So just to be absolutely clear, pitching is not a science, and there's no absolute right method or wrong method, and I'll explain a bit why. But generally speaking, the idea is that there is no one way to get the best pitch you can. There are multiple ways, and even then, I can't tell you which is the best way. I can't tell you which is the worst way. So asking the question, what makes a great elevator pitch? Because mentioned earlier, usually people don't ask you about for your elevator pitch. They ask you more to talk about your game. So for me, and very general definition, it is to simply convey the overall concept in an exciting way. So I'm going to break this down into 3 traits that you can consider as you move on. The first is keep it simple. At the start, I said 8 seconds, no more. Reason being is that humans' attention span generally only lasts 8 seconds. After 8 seconds, they lose interest. So no matter how great your pitch is, no matter how great your idea is, the longer you talk about it, the longer you go on, they will lose interest. And 8 seconds might not seem like a lot, but don't worry if you're worrying about cutting back on content and missing out on details. If they like your pitch, if they find your idea interesting, they will ask you more about it. The way I summarize this whole point is, it's like a good joke. It's short, but it has a good punchline at the end. You go on too long explaining a joke, you go on too long with a good story, it's just going to bore people. Keep it short, keep it simple. Next, keep it informative. Even though people ask you to talk about your game, this is not an invitation for you to go on and on about every little detail. Yes, it's something you love to make, it's your own product, but I think most importantly, you should note that you're trying to inform the player of what they will be doing in the game, focusing on do as in the verb or the actions. And, if it's a more artistic game, whether it's tone or feel, especially a narrative game or a visually driven game, audio, you can use those terms too. But again, highlighting the focus on actions of the player. Also, do be careful because when you inform them that if it's a, let's say, third-person action game, or if you use an example, you're also setting the expectation. So be careful when you use phrases, just because if you say it's one thing and it doesn't match up with what they have in mind, that's going to be confusing and that's going to lower their opinion of your game. And I think most importantly, to try to keep it informative, the best way you can measure that is deliver your pitch, your elevator pitch to the person, and then show them your game. If they look surprised and they're thinking, or they tell you, oh, that's not what I was thinking, to me, that's a clear point that it's not informing them, it's not conveying the idea of your game the way you want it to. And it's a sign that you should probably revise it. The last but not least, keep it exciting. Now, this is admittedly difficult to guide people or to show people or demonstrate how excitement works in writing. But generally speaking, if your game has a unique point or hook, this would be a time to bring it up or something to focus in on. Now, another important thing to note is that you want to know what's exciting for the player and not necessarily exciting for you to build on. And you might be surprised of how different these two things are. I'll explain a bit later, but for example, Cuphead, I remember in an interview for the developer, originally they wanted to make the game feel like Mega Man, and they was like, it's just going to be a good run and gun game. But what ended up happening was that the art was so interesting that made it more interesting to the players than the mechanics itself. So that's things to keep on. And generally, I put these three in like an RPG trait triangle called simplicity, between keeping it simple, keeping it informative, and keeping it exciting. So obviously, it's best to try and max out all three, but that's not always the case. Again, pitching is not a science. It's not like three-star rated simplicity, 3-star rated informative, how informative it is, 3-star rating for exciting. That does not always equal better than something else that may push more in one direction or another. Let's go into forming your pitch itself, because pitches are made up of words, and sometimes it can be difficult to draw on them when you have nothing to begin with. So for myself personally, I will always start with a word cloud. And that means writing main adjectives or verbs or genres, any word you want associated with your game, or perhaps even words that you don't want associated with your game. And I write them down because you want to have a clear idea of what words and what imagery you want to associate with your game, especially when you're talking about it. And along this, you can also write down, for example, perhaps your game is more atmospheric and there is a defining moment in the game. Feel free to write it down, because perhaps your game is all about driving to that moment, perhaps a narrative moment. It could be your hook even then. It's also good as well to start writing down inspiration and references, just because if you have not finished the game yet and this is still early in production, to be able to note where you are heading or where you would like to head by saying, oh, it's inspired by this and this, it can really help inform the player as well. So let's start with the first method or formula, which is the direct description. Simple and straightforward. If we have to go back to that triangular attributes on simple, keeping it simple, keeping it informative, keeping it exciting, this would skew more in simple and informative. And what it is that it's like what it says on the tin. You're basically describing directly what the game is. So, is it a third-person shooter game? Is it a point-and-click adventure with focus on mystery? This is a great point to start out on, because it really helps you solidify, gives you the idea of what your game is, especially in terms of words, especially in terms of talking to people. I'll give you an example, a sort of bad example, first-person survival horror. And, at first glance, it seems like, oh, that's pretty good, because, this is going to be tense, obviously first-person survival horror. But it's a lot better to be specific when you can. Because with just this example of first-person horror, it applies to Resident Evil, Amnesia, and also Outlast. It applies to all three games, even though all three games are uniquely distinct from one another. So, I definitely challenge you to, when you are starting out with your direct description pitch, to really think specifically what makes your game stand out from other games that may use a similar pitch. So I think I don't have it here, but I have it. There's a horror, first-person horror game called Albino Lullaby, and part of its pitch is that it's a horror game without jump scares and without gore, and it really sets it apart. So the next format is the mix and match. The whole idea of the mix and match formula for elevator pitch is idea A meets idea B. And it's very convenient when you are making a game that borrows a little bit from multiple genres or multiple art styles, style inspirations, and so on. It's very effective at informing. So in terms of that scale, it scales a lot highly in informative, and it's a little bit exciting because you're drawing on the imagination of the person who's listening to you. And it's great when you can use reference materials, as I mentioned before. When you note down inspirations, this is a good way for people to know what your general idea is. The only problem with this is that it requires people to know the reference material, because if they don't, then you better have another prepared. So this is a good point to note as well, that you don't only have to have one elevator pitch ready. It's good to have multiple, so perhaps one of each version, just something to keep in mind when one doesn't work out the way it does. So for example, Cuphead, I mentioned earlier, I believe in an interview when they first started out, they said that they want to make a game that's like Mega Man meets classic 90s 30s animation. And immediately it conveys the whole, a picture of the game. It plays like Mega Man, but looks like a classic 90s 30s animation. And actually, if you go to the Steam page for Cuphead, and you look at the tiny description beneath the picture profile on the right-hand side, you'll see how this very basic of idea A meets idea B format of an elevator pitch really informs the way they write the rest of their description. And in general, it's a very good place to look at when you're looking for other games to compare your elevator pitch, which is on the Steam page of said game. On the right-hand side, below the profile picture, there'll be a very short description, and you can see where developers go, which direction they head. And that's a very good place to look for other, perhaps not exactly an elevator pitch, but a very close one to it. Although I will bring up one issue / thing to keep in mind is earlier I mentioned it's very useful when you're making a game that's mixing mechanics from multiple genres in games. So I'm going to show you an example where it's not always the best. So in Loop Hero, for those who hasn't played, this is going to be confusing, but stick with me. Early on, when the game was released, there was a lot of journalists, especially news, video games media. They really tried to use the mix and match formula because they say, oh, it's like an auto battler, like auto chess, but also a card strategy game, but meets a resource management game. And it just got so convoluted because it was building these expectations that build up this image that they see in front of them, but the expectation of each of those words don't really match with one another. And instead of it becoming interesting or amusing, it just becomes confusing. So let's take a quick look at how they explain it on their Steam page. So the words are a bit tiny, but just to read it aloud. The Lich has thrown the world into a timeless loop and plunged its inhabitants into never-ending chaos. Wield an expanding deck of mythical cards to place enemies, buildings, and terrain along each unique expedition loop for the brave hero. So you can note that they entirely done away with genres, and instead they opted to keep it simple by highlighting the verbs and action the player used. So here it specifically mentions the card mechanics and placing them and how that might affect the time loop that the hero is in. So again, while it's good for mixing and matching mechanics from different genres, if it gets too confusing, it's always good to go back to the basic. Next, the hook. It's sort of surprising expectations, especially of a genre. So there isn't a real format to this, but the thing is that it completely focuses or completely stars the unique points of your game, and completely so. So this scales more towards excitement and reduces a little bit of simplicity as well as how informative it is, just because it gets people excited and that's something that's important to them. It's very well suited if you have like an innovative mechanic or an idea. And in a common phrase I'll see, it's like, it's something, but something else. So it's a way that you can subvert or you can tell people how innovative it is. So my favorite example of this is it's a fighting game, but with crabs. Because fighting games, you usually imagine 2D, 3D fighters, whether it's Street Fighter, Tekken, and you see crabs, and you're like, how do you? It draws on the person's interest, and with that, you might get Fight Crab, which is a 3D physics brawler where you play as different forms of crustaceans, wielding different weapons. And I do think you should give the trailer a look if you've not seen it before. It's something else. And if you want to learn more about game hooks, Chris Anthony from Tokyo Productions, publishers of Coffee Talk in Indonesia, he wrote a very deep dive into understanding game hooks and how to find the game hook for your game. So I'll post the presentation on the group chat later, but this will be a link to show you his presentation. Next is the last formula is high concept, which is purely driven on excitement. It's almost in favor of excitement over everything else, and it's not always simple. It's not always informative, but it's always interesting usually. And the question you should ask it is sort of like the question Marie Kondo asks is, does it spark? Well, I know she says joy, but the question you should ask yourself is, does it spark excitement? Does it spark imagination? Does it spark intrigue in the person listening to you? And this is a difficult thing to follow because it's a very thin line between confusing someone and getting their attention in the slightest intrigue. One game I think everybody knows that they use a high concept pitch, especially on their Steam page, is the Untitled Goose Game. So this is a direct description for Untitled Goose Game, which is a slapstick stealth sandbox where you are a goose let loose on an unsuspecting village. Make your way around town, from people's back gardens to the high street shops to the village green, setting up pranks, stealing hats, honking a lot, and generally ruining everybody's day. It does what it says on the tin. It describes what you do, where you go, things you do as a goose. But what I love is their high concept, which is it's a lovely morning in the village and you are a horrible goose. It plays on the players, or not even players, the people's imagination, especially when you see online videos of just geese being terrible. It plays on that, and to me it's exciting because it just makes you think of all the horrible things they can do, and you can do that now. The next example I was going to take is actually from the Amnesia Fortnite movie. So for those who don't know, Double Fine is I guess it's no longer independent, but they're a small game developer based in California. They made Psychonauts as well as Brutal Legend, and every year or so they will take 2 weeks off where they will do an internal game jam for 2 weeks. So for like 2 weeks, they'll forget everything they're doing currently and have an internal pitch between people. And for 2 weeks, the winners of those pitches will gather a team and they'll make a game. It's over 2 hours long, but I think it's very good to watch. Again, link is there, not clickable. I'll upload it and people can watch it later, or at least the first 9 minutes. I highly recommend it. I'm going to share with you a pitch I heard from that movie that really illustrates well a high concept pitch done well. So she begins with this slide and she begins saying, since video games have come out, they've done one thing, and that is to level up. And it's amazing. You get your powers, it's awesome, you collect new abilities. And then she goes on to say, what if we take that timeless mechanic and flip it up, where your goal is to level down throughout the game? And then she follows up quickly saying, you are a goddess having to traverse through hell and have to level down to make your way through it. That's a perfect encapsulation of a high concept pitch, because she explains the direction she's going for, the general idea that you have to level down. And immediately in my mind, it's like, well, how do you make that interesting? It immediately gives me excitement for whatever she and her team makes. I'll say that her idea is selected, so it's really cool to see it played out. I do recommend watching it. And now, finally, to our last section, which is basically don't do's. So some things I see over the years from people who begin, starting out, like I think these are common mistakes you can avoid. So the first one is, if your game is a narrative game, don't explain the plot. Yes, the story is interesting, but it's just wordy. So this is from Yakuza 6. This is not taken from their small description, as you can see, but this whole paragraph talks about the story and the plot, for beat, what happens, the main points, what to expect. And generally, it's wordy, and it only matters when people care about your characters and story. But if it's the first time you're meeting them, they won't care about your story. They won't care about your characters. So instead, let's take a look at their short description, which explains Yakuza 6 as, step into Japan's criminal underworld in this explosive action brawler starring legendary Yakuza Kazuma Kiryu, who's hell-bent on unraveling the truth around his daughter's tragic accident. And something I think to keep in mind that you see often with film synopsis is that they will explain like the tone or the general genre of the. So it's like, for example, is it lighthearted? Is it a charming film? Or if it's a horror film, is it a thriller? Is it suspenseful? You can use general motifs as well as tone to describe the narrative of your game without you having to explain every beat of it and be interesting. And again, as mentioned earlier, if they're interested, they'll ask you more about it. Next is, I'll often see the phrase simple to play, difficult to master. Don't do this, because generally speaking, it's a phrase that's used by advertisers for their large games, and it's something they found to work on a larger scale. But when it comes to making a pitch and you're trying to draw, intrigue, excitement, this is almost a given to the game. It'd be more interesting if you say that it is difficult to play and difficult to master. Next is when you use a successful game in your pitch. While it is very tempting, especially when you're a student, to say, because this idea is successful, we will do it and we will add in, so let's say Pokemon Go meets Garfield. It conveys a lot of the idea, but it's not exciting. So keep in mind that mentioning an exciting or a successful game doesn't automatically make your game any more successful or exciting. And last but not least is, again, harkening back to that point about keeping it simple. Don't share too much. 8 seconds maximum. If people are interested, they'll let you know. Otherwise, keep it short and don't share too much. And last but not least, this is a very important point I'm going to make about pitching, which is that you should practice it, especially aloud, because writing something in words and saying it out is very different. And ultimately, the whole point of the elevator pitch is to gather someone's attention. And you can't really measure someone else's attention. You can only see if they react well to it. So practice it on your friends or your colleagues. And especially if they have any questions afterwards, listen to them and listen what questions comes up in their head. This is a question that should be included in your pitch. So for example, people might ask you, is this first person or third person? If it comes up a lot and you think that point of your mechanics or your game should be included or should be notable, then include in your pitch. I think feedback is especially important. But yeah, thank you. That's my presentation done. And if people would like to contact me, I have my contact details there. Why don't we move back into Q&A then?
When will you use these pitches? Like, do we just like? I was like, I'm like always thinking is like, oh yeah, I got an elevator pitch, but who do I set like these kind of things to? Do I just right? Yeah. Like who are we aiming at? Like, are we just like aiming at our own team because we can like solidify idea or something like that, or like just aiming out?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And generally speaking, you should not only be focusing on one. So as much as I said earlier, like, focus towards something, it's always good to have variance on a, pitch. Like this is why I start with that word cloud, because having, solidifying which words you want to know or which ideas you want to put forward, it helps you keep that idea in mind, and then how you pitch it can differ or vary slightly. So like you say, when you pitch it to your, team, can be different from when you're pitching to a publisher, and that's fine. And it's good to be able to prepare for all of them. But generally speaking, you need to first find what works, because, and that's whether it's working with your team or working with a publisher. Well, obviously, most likely you find something that works for your team first. And then from then on, you can play with variants. But interesting ideas will have a reaction from most people. So I advise you prepare variants, but ultimately, if an idea is good enough to get a reaction from somebody or multiple somebodies, it'll probably work well with anybody else you speak to. With that said, though, when it comes to like longer form pitching, like you'll see people talk about pitch decks, that's a whole entirely different topics. And that's something more dedicated towards investors or publisher facing meetings. And if you want, I have examples of pitch decks that I will actually have it in my presentation, and you can skim through those if you want to have like a longer form, ones that are more, 30 minutes, in mind in terms of the meeting length. Those are more focused for publishers. But again, this is more about that 8 seconds when you meet someone and they ask you what your game is about.
Yeah, makes sense to me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Should we
Oh, sorry.
when we are doing the mix and match the method, and when we are doing the official description of our game, is that good to like say or just refer your reference game directly in your description, or like I think like when you're 8-second pitch with your friend, I think it's good to just directly say your reference. But when we are doing into the official one, is that good, and how should we avoid it or using other way to do it?
Yeah, so I would, like you mentioned, and like you had the idea, generally it's best to avoid reference material in your description, especially when writing the official one, unless it's public domain. So, like for those references, you can put them there, but like you mentioned, if it's like a name reference, probably not best to put them there. And that's where the direct description comes best, the one that plainly explains what the game is. But yeah, you basically got it right. Is that for descriptions, you probably should not use mix and match. It's only best for when talking to friends or colleagues, or even at a convention, just to give people an idea.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you for your question. I will say I did do this presentation with Polytechnic University a couple of weeks ago, and there was another good question, which is, should you prepare variants for different regions? And absolutely, especially if you're going to a indie festival outside of Hong Kong or in somewhere in Asia or the US, it's definitely good to update your references and inspirations to local tastes. So, like for example, specifically in Asia, ARPGs, I think everybody here knows stands for action RPG, but the term ARPG is not as widely used in the US. So you just use action RPG in that case. It's good to consider regional variants when you are going to international events. But again, that's only for those specific regions when you are going there.
Yeah, and also the like shoot 'em up game in Japan. Japan they name it STG game, but it's not common in the US.
Exactly, that's a very good point. But yeah, these are definitely things to think about. Like I think your questions so far is very telling to me that you really understand how you should do this and how this should be done. So I think you got it.
Do you have any ideas to get around maybe the possible language barrier? So for example, if you go to Korea and they can't speak English, so you naturally find it hard to basically pitch your game to the natives over there. So
I think the only thing is to get a translator.
Right.
I think that's the unfortunate thing, is that you don't know how effective it plays into their language if you don't know their language at all. So at that point, it's best to prepare perhaps multiple, written variants, and then show them to a translator and ask them how best does it transfer, to their language, like which one speaks more to them if they were to translate it themselves.
Right, got it.
If they see your pitch and they're like, oh, that's like this game in Korea, let's say, then you could ask him, well, tell me more about that game, and you might be able to use that as the reference point when they're translating it instead. So that's the only way I can think about it.
Got it. Thanks.